Adding an S-curve has become pretty much the norm in modern day photography. No matter if you wanna add just a tiny bit of contrast or you wanna go for that strong cinematic look, you're gonna be adding an S-curve to your photos. And the thing with the tone curve tool is that it's not only affecting the brightness level. The tone curve can actually mess up your colors. And whenever we're adding a strong S-curve to our photos, we're messing around with the saturation levels in the image without even realizing. So today I'm gonna first try and explain how the tone curve actually works and what happens to the saturation in the image whenever we're pushing a pretty strong tone curve. And then I'm gonna show you how to work around this limitation and how to get back some of that color density that you might be losing in your shadows. But first, give me 5 seconds to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Vlad, I'm a portrait photographer and Lightroom nerd, and I spent a lot of time lately developing tools and presets for Lightroom because I hate going to Photoshop every time I need to do something just a little bit more advanced to my photos. And that's exactly why I turned my photography YouTube channel into something that's now dedicated to advanced Lightroom tutorials, and that's exactly what you're watching today. So I'm gonna stop yapping about myself, and here into Lightroom I'm gonna start with this photo, which you can see it's pretty neutral and pretty low contrast. But if I go in here in the tone curve and apply a pretty strong S curve, something that is gonna bring back the contrast in the photo, let's also add a bit of a filmic toe just for that raised black look, and maybe tone down the highlights a tiny bit using the tone curve while also recovering some of the details. You can see that now the photo looks a lot better. But also, if I toggle the tone curve off and on, you can see, especially in his jacket, which was already pretty saturated, that the photo gained a ton of saturation. And I'm gonna be toggle it once again and pay attention to the mountains in the background. They're getting pretty blue as well, and I haven't touched the saturation whatsoever. And that's just part of the problem. The midtones are getting saturated because our curve in the midtones is pretty vertical, aka it's adding contrast, but at the ends of the spectrum where we have a much horizontal looking curve, we're actually losing a ton of saturation. And I can show you this in action by creating a large radial gradient on the bottom part of the photo where we have the very saturated jacket. And in this radial gradient, I'm gonna pull down on the tone curve, creating a bit of a filmic toe that's exaggerated for the purpose of this demonstration. But when I toggle that off, you can see how much saturation the jacket lost and how these shadows are becoming muddy instead of just losing the brightness and keeping the strong saturation that the jacket originally had. And exactly the same thing will happen to our highlights, where we have that filmic shoulder. We're losing saturation, but I don't mind it as much because film naturally has a bit of a saturation roll-off towards the highlights, and I really like to emulate film. And now that we know that this is something that happens when we're messing around with the tone curve, let's actually try and understand what's happening. You see, our photos live in the RGB color space, and whenever we're pulling around on one of these points in the tone curve, we're actually moving around the curve in all three of the red, green, and blue channel. And saturation is defined by how far apart one of the channels is from the others. So for example, if I add a point in the red channel and pull down on it, you can see that the photo is getting more sand because I'm moving the red channel away from the other two. But the closer the three lines are together, the less saturated the photo is. But because when we're adding a really strong S-curve like the one that I have in here right now, we're basically squishing together parts of the line, we're basically creating a zone where we don't have enough space for the colors to be further apart from each other, and that's why we're losing saturation. And this can get even worse if your line looks something like this, where it's actually going to affect the hues in the photos because we pushed the dominant channel so far upwards with our S-curve that the other two channels are getting closer to it and basically modifying the hue in the zone. So, in conclusion, if you start your edit with a neutral camera profile like Adobe Neutral or Camera Neutral and then proceed to add a ton of contrast using a tone curve, you are going to end up with a photo that has a ton of saturation in the midtones and then has a really strong saturation roll-off, let's call it that. But basically muddy highlights and shadows. And the worst part is that if you're not aware of this problem, you might be pushing the saturation of the entire photo to compensate for the muddy shadows and end up with photos like mine, which are a bit oversaturated, probably because I was trying to compensate for those muddy shadows. So let me show you how to decouple the saturation from the tone curve and how you can get richer tones if that's something that you want in your final photos. And we're gonna do that with this self-portrait that I took a few days ago, and I'm gonna start by moving it to Adobe Neutral, which already lowered my contrast, but I'm gonna push that even further to recover some more details. I'm gonna push my shadow details up, my blacks as well just a tiny bit, and now let's recover the highlights, and we ended up with a photo that looks pretty neutral. And what I would normally do in a situation like this is come in here to my tone curve and start to pull down on my shadows and then bring the midtones up so I can recover the details in my face and then create a nice filmic toe on the upper part of the spectrum in order to create a nice look to the photo. Afterwards, I would start to color grade it and maybe even apply one more curve as a filmic tone limiter, which is one of the products that I sell on my website. But today, all I'm doing is this strong S-curve that helped me get a bit of a more contrasty look. Let's call it that. I am not gonna call this cinematic at all. But as you can see, after applying this, I also got my photo to look pretty saturated. And to deal with that, we have this slider over here right under my tone curve. And if I pull this back to the left, the photo gets desaturated once again. But now the photo looks really desaturated. And because I want to target this based on the luminance value in the photo, I'm gonna go ahead and create a new mask. I'm gonna go for a luminance mask, and I'm just gonna click here to enable the mask across my entire photo for now. And in this mask, I'm going to push saturation probably to plus 50 or maybe even more. And then to prevent it from being even across the entire photo, I'm gonna start and pull back from my highlights because as you saw before, this area was already getting pretty oversaturated. And right now, my photo is starting to look nice, but I can push the saturation a bit more and try to feather the luminance gradient just a tiny bit more so my photo looks saturated but none of my shadows look muddy and the highlights don't get desaturated. And now let's compare how would this image look with the two methods. On the left is the usual tone curve approach and on the right is the method that I just showed you. And right out of the gate you can see that the color density on the photo on the right is much bigger. You can see this especially in the highlights area on the sky where behind my back you can see how much more blue I have in the sky compared to the dull sky that I have in the usual tone curve approach. And also you can see a bit of the hue shifting that's happening in my beard where on the photo on the left my beard looks a bit reddish while over here it has a few more details and it's still keeping the yellow look that's coming from the sun. And keep in mind, all this is with a very simple edit, no color grading whatsoever, just the tone curve and some basic adjustments. And I was still able to get a photo with a lot of color density without having to go through a lot of steps that would normally compensate for the amount of color that I was losing while applying a really aggressive tone curve. And because I don't want you to say that that was just a fluke, let's do this once again. Let's switch this photo to Adobe Neutral. It's gonna make it rather flat. I want to push the white just a tiny bit so this area actually feels bright, and I'm not gonna do much more other than add some grains so I can actually have some texture in this photo. And I'm gonna start playing with the S-curve. Again, we're doing a pretty aggressive S-curve. This is a silhouette photo after all, so we want our shadows to be really dark, want our highlights to feel bright, but at the same time, we want this to be a really saturated photo. And because of all that contrast, we're really getting in a point where we're getting more saturation in the midtones over here, but we're not getting a lot of saturation in our shadows or the very bright highlights right next to the person's face. So What I'm gonna do is add some saturation with the saturation slider, and this just accentuated the problem that our tone curve created. But anyway, I'm gonna right click and create a virtual copy. And on this virtual copy, I'm going to apply my method of decoupling the saturation from the tone curve. I set the refine saturation slider back to 0, and I'm going to create the luminance base mask in which I'm going to add my saturation. And I want to make sure that it looks somewhat uniform. So right now the highlights are getting oversaturated, so I'm going to push back on those just a little bit. And I think I've got my edit. So now let's compare the two versions. On the left, I have the usual tone curve, which you can see is starting to lose saturation towards the edges of the frame where my midtones are going into the shadows. And also, I can see how my highlights are super white right next to my character. But at the same time, my midtones are really saturated, and that looks nice, but would prevent me from pushing the saturation any further. While on the right side with the new method, the saturation gradient is much nicer and the photo is saturated more evenly without areas being oversaturated while other areas feel like they're missing color. And the biggest difference is in this bottom part of the photo right here, where on the left you can see how I basically have no color behind of my character on this left side, while on the right side with the new method I was able to retain a lot more color density in my shadows. And this amount of color density in my shadows is exactly what makes this method worth it, because let's face it, it's much more time consuming to do this whenever you're editing a photo instead of just adding a S-curve and call it a day. But if you want to get film-like colors with color density in your shadows, you need to do this workaround if you don't want to go to Photoshop or other editing softwares. So I don't think this is a method that you should use on every single one of your photos, but for the moments where you want more color density, either in your highlights or your shadows, give it a try and let me know how it worked in the comments down below. This was it for today. I really hope you feel like you learned something, and if you did, maybe share this video with a friend or go check out the other tools that I sell on my website right there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.